I want to talk about using cover crops as a way to rejuvenate and revive land that is deprived of biology and organic matter. Because one of the criticisms that I often get from people who visit our farm is that our style of no-till, using a deep mulch system, simply isn't feasible for most regions of the world. And they're correct. They're 100% correct. Because there are very few farms around the world that have the necessary resources in their area to apply the same generous amounts of organic matter that we apply to our land to both boost fertility and simultaneously eliminate weeds. Now, even when compost is available to other farms, even in our area, it's often too cost prohibitive for them to buy in large amounts. And so we need to think of an alternative way of building soil fertility and reducing our weed pressure so that we can get on with farming in a way that's profitable. So that brings me to the topic of cover cropping. And on our farm, we've used cover cropping very successfully on several areas. And when done right, you'll be amazed at how easily dead soils can be revitalized and weeds can almost be eliminated along with pests as well. Now, let's just talk a little bit about how we want to get started. And of course, we have to recognize that the downside with this approach, as opposed to using the deep mulch method that we use of layering down copious amounts of compost, the downside with using a cover cropping method is that it's going to take significantly longer and we're going to need a lot more labor cost in order to get the same job done. But regardless, so for some of us, that's our only option. And so let's explore how we can use cover cropping as a way to revitalize land. The thing that we need to begin with is a weed-free garden. And when I say weed-free, I mean free of all living plants in the plot of land that we want to start to cover crop. And vigilance here is really, really important. It's going to save time and money down the road. So let's start off right. Now, if our plot in the first scenario is generally weed-free, imagine a weed-free plot. Maybe it's got a few scattered perennial weeds. Take your shovel, you dig those out. Even if you're dealing on the scale of an acre or two, get out there and deal with all your perennial weeds and get rid of all annual weeds that you're finding on your plot of land. In the case of new weeds that pop up during your elimination process, just use a hoe or a rake or mechanical cultivation equipment to eliminate that. Now that's a preferred scenario, but I realize that's not the reality. For some of us out there, we're dealing with a plot with really pernicious, insidious weeds that we need to have a more aggressive approach. And if you're dealing with a situation like that, which we were, in some areas of the farm where we had quackgrass and horsetail and morning glory and dandelion buttercup and all the big enemies of organic growers, you're going to need a more aggressive approach. And that's where cultivation equipment like a tiller or a power harrow is going to come to your aid as a one-time solution, even though for us on the farm here, it violates a fundamental law, and that is avoid disturbing the soil at all cost. But our consolation here is that in our first year, we're going to have massive soil disturbance, but that will only be necessary in the first year as we prepare the land for a cover crop. You won't be taking a holiday in your first year. Every other week throughout the heat of summer, you're going to run over your land, chopping up and exposing every root and tuber and rhizome to the scorching sun. You're going to exhaust the weed seed bank and every green thing. I hate this approach. I feel guilty about this approach, rather. It's a good approach, but I feel guilty about it because it's so damaging and devastating to land. But if our objective is to eliminate weeds, it works very, very well. Now, depending on how quickly you've eliminated weeds in your plot of land, whether it was, a bare piece of land with very few weeds, or it had some aggressive weeds, this may take some time. And I realize that you might not be ready to start your cover crop until midsummer, but starting right is crucial. And so beginning with bare ground that's weed-free, even if it contains millions of weed seeds per square foot, we're ready to get started. Okay, so at this point, I cannot overemphasize that once you're committed. And at this point, you have a zero tolerance for any unwanted plant in your garden. So you use a seek and destroy approach. You see a weed, it gets destroyed. You're the grower. You make the decisions of who's welcome and who's not in your garden, and choose wisely, or you're going to be creating hours and hours of unnecessary work down the road. For your first cover crops, and assuming that you're, in your early summer, maybe midsummer at this point in time, you want to choose plants that are easy to weed, and you want to sow your seed in straight rows in permanent beds. So seek out your bed system that you want to employ. Where are your pathways? Where's your bed? And for then ever after, you have a permanent bed system in your garden. I recommend that you choose a multi-species cover crop. It's always preferred. But for now, what I recommend is that you, within each bed, you choose a single species. So you may have alternating beds of different species, but within one bed, choose the same type of plant. It's just going to reduce your workload, and your approach is going to be more methodical and efficient as you eliminate weeds. So what are your options for cover crop? I think this depends largely on the time of year, your climate, the size of your plot, and how much time you can spend on weed control. There's a whole bunch of factors here that you're going to have to weigh and decide on. I like to use things like peas and corn, sunflowers, fava beans, even potatoes, anything that's easy to weed and produces lots of green matter. Grains also make great introductory cover crops with their deep roots, but the challenge here can often be keeping them weed free. Now, don't scatter your grain around over the field. You're going to plant your grains in nice straight rows. I usually space them far enough apart so that I can easily get a hoe or a wheel hoe down there. I recommend you also include annual flowers in your cover cropping scheme as well, but make sure you cut them back before they seed. You don't want your flowers to become a weed seed problem in your garden. Things like Lacy Facilia and White Alyssum are good options. They're not deep rooting, but they're going to bring in the pollinators and the insects to your garden. Now, stay away from cover crops that are difficult to kill, such as white clover, also known as Dutch clover. That can be a real challenge for us to eliminate later on, and we don't want to have a problem. I recommend you use a cultivator to prepare a seed bed for your cover crop. Nice smooth soil, just in the traditional way that we would normally do our garden with a tiller. And that'll be your last use of the tiller or the cultivator. After this, I highly recommend you install an irrigation system so that you can grow your cover crop as quickly as possible and as uniformly as possible. And then, even before weeds are visible and the cover crop maybe hasn't even emerged at this point, you've got to get in that garden and scuff up the surface between the rows and down the pathways with a hoe or a rake. My wheel hoe fits perfectly down the beds, down the rows, and I use a pathway wheel hoe, and it covers a big area, and it's very quick and very efficient way of dealing with weeds. Your task here is to encourage as many weed seeds in the weed seed bank to germinate as possible. Any weed seed in the top 2 inches of soil needs to be eliminated, needs to sprout, and then you can deal with it by killing it between the watering periods and the drying off periods in between. Now, when the cover crop emerges, you're going to have to get on your hands and knees and hand weed along the rows of whatever crop you're growing. And you'll now appreciate why I'm recommending that you grow corn or sunflowers or fava beans, because peas, they're really easy to germinate. They germinate quickly. It's an easy seed to grow, and they're growing in nice, warm, moist soil. And so you'll easily get them up to size. And then when they are grown up, they're really, really easy to keep weed free. So when your cover crop is up a couple of inches, I would recommend you mound the soil around the plants using a rake. And then a week later, you're going to go along and you're going to remove that mound. The next week, you mound up again. And every time you do this, you're disturbing soil, you're quickly killing weed seeds, and you're exhausting the weed seed bank. You're also going to be exhausted, but your persistence will pay off, and you'll be amazed at how quickly your soil will become free of weeds. Now, there are a bunch of reasons why we plant a cover crop in our first couple of years, and besides the ease of weeding, which is an obvious one, we're also going to be able to quickly boost microbial life in the soil. Most plants, especially more sophisticated plants, exude a significant amount of carbon sugar that they produce through photosynthesis. And they exude that or secrete that into the root zone to feed microbes. Plants are self-serving here. Their generosity is self-serving. Because in exchange for these carbon sugars, the microorganisms in the soil are activated and they absorb these carbon sugars, which they need as an energy source. And then when they're preyed upon by other members of the soil food web, they deposit these nutrients in the root zone of the plant, and the plant easily absorbs these. They're in exactly the right form that plants need. It's an amazing symbiotic relationship that happens between plants and microorganisms. Now, unfortunately, through our abusive treatment of land by the repeated cultivation that I was promoting earlier, your biology in the soil will probably be absent when you seed your first crops. And so the question is, how do we restore balance and reintroduce critical members of the soil food web? There's a couple of ways of accomplishing this that I know about. The first is through the application of aged living compost, okay? Compost that's full of life, and I'm talking the full spectrum. So we have things like bacteria, fungi, protozoa, nematodes, and the full range of organisms that we want to introduce to our garden. So we can use a direct compost application, or we can use a compost extract in a liquid form that's teeming with a vast array of microbes that are ready to get to work with plants. And even a small amount of microbes, when deposited around living plants, quickly proliferate and reproduce, and they'll have a huge impact on the microbial population in your soil and consequently on plant health. And immediately this is going to attract larger organisms of the soil food web, like worms, which may be quite absent in the soil as well, but they're going to move in. The second approach, if you don't have a compost available, is to attract flying insects or birds to the area. Frass, or insect poop, is nutrient rich and contains a wide array of essential microbes that plants need to survive and thrive. And so these insects are moving around from property to property, and when they visit your farm or garden, they're going to deposit some of these nutrients and microbes from other areas into your garden, and so replenish the microbial population. And then just think of the millions of microbes in the droppings from a visiting blackbird who is busily devouring fat earthworms, say on neighbor Sue's property earlier that morning. The question is, how do you bring these winged friends to your garden in the first place? It's simple. You provide them with food and shelter. And that's why biodiversity in our gardens is essential, even in the cover cropping stage. But there's another reason why we want to grow a cover crop, not only to boost the microbial life in the soil, we also want to produce as much carbon as quickly as possible. And a good example is corn that even from a July seeding can be 5 feet tall by September. It's fairly deep rooting, it's got a pretty aggressive root system, and it produces all this green fibrous material that makes great future microbe food. We use a flail mower to grind up this cover crop and all cover crops, and we grind it into a pulp that lays on the surface, that acts as a mulch, retains moisture in our soil, feeds the microbial population, and allows us to then prepare for a subsequent cover crop. And if we can time this right, we'll be ready for a second cover crop by the fall. And you'll be late in the season at this point, and so you're going to have to be careful about your options are now limited as to which cover crops you can choose. So I personally here, a favorite is to use fava beans or grains as a second cover crop because they're fairly cold tolerant, especially the grain crops, rye, barley, oats, wheat. Some of the ancient grains are really good. They're deep rooting, and you can seed these into your garden, and they're going to be there with you all through the winter, providing a cover, feeding microbes, doing a little bit of carbon sequestering through the even cold of the winter for us here anyway on the west coast. And when the weather warms up, you'll be able to sequester as much carbon as possible. So The other thing is you might at this point be ready for your first crop of food producing plants, and that is things like garlic. Depending on, the fertility of your soil, garlic might be a really good option at this point. But regardless of what you seed or plant in your garden, you need to recognize that your work and your battle with weeds isn't over yet. Some weeds like chickweed or dandelion are primed to germinate late in the summer. They've been sitting dormant all summer, but late summer, early fall, when the nights are cool, that's when they pop out of the ground. So we have to remain on guard, and weeds are much more difficult to deal with as we head into the fall and winter, especially in my wet climate on the West Coast. It's just really difficult to kill them, and so often it means you're weeding on your hands and knees. And that's why I say your plot must be manageable in size. And that might mean for some of you 1/8 of an acre or 1/4 of an acre at the maximum, unless you have more labor inputs. But throughout this process of building fertility and restoring microbial life in your soil, it's important that you look beyond the production of food crops for consumption or for market in the first year. Your main purpose here is to rejuvenate and restore the land to a point where you can grow great vegetables profitably without expending hours and hours and hours weeding. So you may need to keep your day job. You're not reliant on an income from your garden at this point. You're simply restoring fertility. And then you might ask, well, couldn't you use vegetables as a cover crop and at the same time realize that for a crop for a harvest that you could sell? I think you can. I mentioned corn and sunflowers and peas and others, but I think you need to recognize here that most annual vegetables don't produce copious amounts of green matter, and they often have a shallow and very simplistic root system that doesn't work in association with microbes in the same way that more sophisticated plants will. Now, also, finicky vegetables are more susceptible to pests, whose populations can balloon out of control in an unbalanced ecosystem. A good example of that is wireworm in my area. If you're going in your first year here with a crop like even lettuce, wireworm can decimate a crop like that, and you're just not going to be even realizing any plant in your garden. So you want to choose something that's a little more aggressive, a little more susceptible to pest. But the second year, that's when I think you're ready to introduce your first food producing crops. Again, choosing easy to weed vegetables is recommended, but at the same time, I wouldn't hesitate at this point to begin growing small amounts of carrots and beets or anything that requires a little more vigilance or more careful weeding. Again, make sure you don't do too much. Feed your plants and use a mulch from your compost heap that you're hopefully have going by this time on your property. It could have been, you could have an active compost going that's been there for a year. That makes an excellent compost that you can then use for your garden. And if you've been vigilant, you'll notice a vast reduction in weeds in your second year, and your garden will scarcely need cultivation. And this is when things start to get fun. Eventually, you'll be able to hang up the hoe for good, and that's a point that all of you need to strive to achieve in your garden. Now, you'll notice throughout my little talk here that I've been insistent on developing a no-till system that's also weed-free. These go hand in hand, and I'm astounded and dumbfounded that some organic growers have been producing food for decades. They're still in the weeds, and I'm alarmed by that, and I'm wondering, why they're not noticing what's happening in the no-till movement, because it's really quite possible to farm in a weed-free way. Every year they fire up the old tiller, they destroy soil structure, they volatilize nitrogen and carbon, they bring up millions of weed seeds, and they give themselves hours and hours of countless needless work. Now understand that some of these farmers, they don't pay themselves, and maybe they don't pay their kids either. And they don't see labor as an input cost. But my perspective here is that regardless of whether the work is being paid with monetarily, the time spent on weeding means that we're spending less time on really productive things like making great compost, mulching, seeding, harvesting, caring for our chickens, saving seed, whatever other task that our farm may demand, and be productive at the same time. In conclusion, if we're to develop a low input, high output system of agriculture, even on large scale, because this is quite doable, maybe on your scale, maybe half an acre, 1 acre at a time, but eventually you can build this up. We're now at 26 acres. Now some of this was using a deep mulching system, but other areas where we just used a cover crop to amend land, it's quite doable, and we can get up to a large scale production provided we're profitable at the same time, so we have money to put forward to develop new land. But if we're to develop this low input, high output system of agriculture, we'll need to find ways of improving fertility and at the same time eliminating pests and weeds using resources that are available to us on our farm or within a closed system of regional farms. Introducing massive amounts of off-farm compost to achieve this is simply unrealistic, and most regions in the world it would be utterly impossible, and so we need to find a different approach. And so that's why I mention and talk about the cover cropping approach. It's not the only one. Gabe Brown has done some astounding, amazing work in using bovine or cows to replenish land. That's been his vehicle, and he's done some amazing work there to build topsoil. Our vehicle here to do that is to use a cover cropping system in conjunction with animals. You're going to be better off yet. So if you can find a strategy in order to achieve that, go for it. But as I've pointed out, in the system that I'm advocating for here with cover cropping, the work needs to be front loaded. And the first couple of years can be grueling and overwhelming. But if you're persistent and you can learn to work with nature to restore fertility to land, your farming will become enjoyable, it'll become rewarding, and it'll become profitable. So good luck with that.